The scorching New Mexico sun beat down relentlessly on the streets of Albuquerque as Special Agent Zora Thompson made her way through the bustling downtown area. At 35 years old, Zora cut an impressive figure in her crisp white blouse and dark blazer, her FBI badge glinting at her hip. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her deep brown eyes scanned her surroundings with the practiced vigilance of a seasoned law enforcement officer. Zora had been with the FBI's Albuquerque field office for the past 7 years, quickly distinguishing herself as one of their top agents. Her analytical mind and unwavering dedication to justice had earned her the respect of her colleagues and superiors alike. Today, she was heading to a local coffee shop to meet an informant about a high-profile drug trafficking case she'd been working on for months. As she walked, Zora couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had been gnawing at her lately. Despite her accomplishments, she was acutely aware of the additional scrutiny and obstacles she faced as a black woman in law enforcement. The nationwide protests against police brutality and systemic racism over the past year had only intensified the complex dynamics at play. Zora's thoughts were interrupted as she arrived at the coffee shop. She scanned the patrons, looking for her contact, when suddenly raised voices from outside caught her attention. She turned to see a heated confrontation unfolding on the sidewalk between a young black man and 2 police officers. One of the officers, a stocky white man with close-cropped gray hair and cold blue eyes, had his hand on his holstered weapon as he aggressively questioned the young man. His name tag identified him as Officer Derek Larsson. His partner, a younger Hispanic officer named Miguel Sanchez, stood back with an uncomfortable expression, occasionally glancing around nervously. Zora's instincts kicked in, and she moved closer to observe the situation. She could hear snippets of the conversation. The young man insisting he'd done nothing wrong, Officer Larsson demanding identification and accusing him of looking suspicious. The tension was palpable, with Larsson's tone growing increasingly hostile. Unable to stand by any longer, Zora approached the group. "Is there a problem here, officers?" she asked calmly, flashing her FBI credentials. Officer Larsson's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance. "This doesn't concern you," he said dismissively. "We're conducting official police business." Zora stood her ground, her voice firm but measured. "I understand, but I couldn't help noticing the situation seems to be escalating. Perhaps I can be of assistance." Larsson's face contorted with barely concealed contempt. "Listen here, little lady. I don't know how you got that badge, but this is a police matter. Why don't you run along and play FBI somewhere else?" The blatant disrespect and racism in Larsson's tone sent a jolt of anger through Zora, but she maintained her composure. She was no stranger to dealing with prejudiced individuals in positions of authority. "Officer Larsson," she said, emphasizing his name, "I am a federal agent, and I have every right to inquire about a potential civil rights violation occurring in my jurisdiction. Now, what probable cause do you have for detaining this young man?" The young man in question, who appeared to be in his early 20s, looked at Zora with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Larsson, however, was livid. His face reddened as he took a menacing step toward Zora. "You're interfering with a police investigation," he snarled. "I'm placing you under arrest." Before Zora could react, Larsson roughly grabbed her arm and spun her around, slamming her against the wall of the building. The sudden impact knocked the wind out of her lungs as Larsson began to cuff her hands behind her back. "Officer, this is completely unwarranted," Zora managed to say, struggling to maintain her composure as a mix of shock, anger, and humiliation washed over her. She was acutely aware of the growing crowd of onlookers, many with phones out recording the incident. Larsson ignored her protests, tightening the cuffs painfully. "You have the right to remain silent." He began reciting mechanically, a smug satisfaction evident in his voice. Officer Sanchez finally spoke up, his voice wavering. "Derek, maybe we should—" "Shut it, rookie," Larsson snapped. "I'm teaching this uppity fed a lesson about respecting real police work." As Larsson roughly patted her down, supposedly searching for weapons, Zora's mind raced. She knew this arrest was completely unjustified, but she also understood the dangers of resisting, especially as a black woman being arrested by a clearly racist officer. She forced herself to take deep breaths, reminding herself that the truth would come out eventually. The young man Larsson had initially been harassing watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. "This is messed up," he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Larsson whirled on him. "You want to join her for obstructing justice?" The young man quickly backed away, hands raised placatingly. As Larsson began leading Zora to his patrol car, she caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Maria Delgado, a local journalist she'd worked with on previous cases. Maria's eyes were wide with shock as she furiously scribbled notes. Zora gave her a subtle nod, knowing the reporter would help bring attention to this injustice. The drive to the police station was tense and uncomfortable. Zora sat silently in the back of the patrol car, her wrists aching from the overly tight handcuffs. She could hear Larsson smugly recounting the arrest to someone over the radio, embellishing details to paint himself as the hero, putting an arrogant federal agent in her place. Officer Sanchez remained quiet, occasionally glancing back at Zora with a mix of guilt and uncertainty in his eyes. She met his gaze steadily, silently challenging him to speak up against his partner's actions. As they pulled into the station parking lot, Zora steeled herself for what was to come. She knew the booking process would be humiliating, but she was determined to maintain her dignity and fight this unlawful arrest through the proper channels. Larsson roughly pulled her from the car, parading her through the station as officers and staff looked on with varying degrees of surprise and curiosity. Zora held her head high, refusing to let Larsson's attempts to demean her succeed. At the booking desk, a middle-aged sergeant named Bill Collins raised an eyebrow as Larsson shoved Zora forward. "What's this about, Larsson?" he asked, eyeing Zora's professional attire and composed demeanor. "Arrested this one for interfering with a police investigation and resisting arrest," Larsson declared proudly. "She claims to be FBI, if you can believe it." Collins frowned, clearly skeptical. "Did you verify her credentials?" Larsson waved dismissively. "Please, it's obviously a fake badge, probably some sovereign citizen nut job." Zora spoke up calmly. "Sergeant Collins, I am indeed a special agent with the FBI's Albuquerque field office. If you contact my supervisor, Special Agent in Charge David Martinez, he can confirm my identity and sort out this misunderstanding." Collins studied her for a moment before nodding. "We'll look into that. For now, we need to process you." He began asking Zora standard booking questions, which she answered succinctly and professionally. As Collins input her information, Larsson hovered nearby, interjecting with snide comments. "Make sure you get a good mugshot," he sneered. "Bet she's got a rap sheet a mile long." Zora bit back a sharp retort, reminding herself that engaging with Larsson would only make the situation worse. Instead, she focused on memorizing names, badge numbers, and details of the unlawful arrest that she would include in her eventual complaint. The booking process seemed to drag on interminably. Zora was fingerprinted, photographed, and subjected to a humiliating strip search. Standard procedure, they claimed, though she strongly suspected Larsson had pushed for it out of pure malice. Throughout it all, Zora struggled to maintain her composure. The degradation and injustice of the situation threatened to overwhelm her at times, but she clung to the knowledge that this ordeal would eventually end. She thought of her parents, her father, a retired Air Force colonel, and her mother, a civil rights attorney, and drew strength from their example of dignity in the face of adversity. Finally, Zora was led to a holding cell and left alone. She sank onto the hard bench, allowing herself a moment to process the whirlwind of emotions she'd been suppressing. Anger, humiliation, and a bone-deep weariness washed over her. How many times would she have to prove herself worthy of respect and equal treatment? How many other black men and women suffered similar indignities without the benefit of her resources and connections? Zora was pulled from her thoughts by the sound of raised voices approaching the holding area. She recognized Larsson's belligerent tone and another, unfamiliar voice responding in clipped, authoritative tones. "I don't give a damn who you are," Larsson was saying. "She's under arrest and she's staying put until..." The cell door swung open, cutting off Larsson's tirade. A tall, distinguished-looking man in his 50s stood in the doorway, radiating barely contained fury. Zora immediately recognized him as Assistant Special Agent in Charge Robert Hawkins, one of the top-ranking officials in the Albuquerque FBI office. "Special Agent Thompson," Hawkins said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Are you all right?" Zora stood, relief washing over her. "Yes, sir, I'm unharmed." Hawkins nodded curtly. "Good. You're being released immediately. We'll sort out this mess back at the office." He turned to Larsson, who was hovering nearby with a mix of confusion and defiance on his face. "Officer Larsson, I suggest you contact your union representative. You'll be hearing from our legal team very soon." As Hawkins led Zora out of the holding area, she could feel the stares of officers and staff following them. Some looked shocked, others guilty or concerned. Larsson's face was a mask of impotent rage as he watched his attempted power play crumble around him. In Hawkins' car, Zora finally allowed herself to relax slightly. "Thank you for coming so quickly, sir," she said. "How did you find out?" Hawkins gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated through traffic. "A local reporter called our press office asking for comment on the arrest of an FBI agent. When they couldn't reach you, they contacted me directly." He shook his head in disbelief. "Zora, I am so sorry this happened to you. It's completely unacceptable, and I promise you, we will pursue every avenue to hold Officer Larsson and the department accountable." Zora nodded, a lump forming in her throat at his genuine concern and support. "I appreciate that, sir. I just keep thinking about how easily this could have gone differently if I didn't have the protection of my badge and position." Hawkins was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said softly. "It's a stark reminder of how much work we still have to do, both within law enforcement and society at large." He glanced at her. "Take some time off if you need it, but knowing you, I suspect you'll want to be involved in pursuing this case." Zora managed a small smile. "You know me well, sir. I won't let Larsson or anyone else intimidate me into backing down. This is exactly why I became an agent, to fight injustice and make a difference." As they pulled into the FBI office parking lot, Zora steeled herself for the difficult days ahead. She knew there would be statements to give, reports to file, and likely a media firestorm to weather. But she was ready to face it all, determined to turn this horrible experience into an opportunity for positive change. Inside the office, Zora was immediately enveloped in a supportive embrace by her partner, Special Agent Marcus Chen. The 38-year-old Asian American agent's usual easygoing demeanor was replaced by fierce protectiveness. "God, Zora, when I heard what happened, are you okay?" Zora returned the hug gratefully, drawing strength from her friend and colleague's unwavering support. "I'm all right, Marcus. It was..." She trailed off, searching for words to describe the ordeal. Marcus squeezed her shoulder. "You don't have to talk about it now if you're not ready. Just know I've got your back, 100%. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Special Agent in Charge David Martinez, his normally affable expression replaced by one of grim determination. "Thompson, Chen, my office, please." As they settled into chairs across from Martinez's desk, Zora could see the mix of anger and concern warring on her supervisor's face. "Zora," he began, his voice gentle, "I am so sorry this happened to you. It's a complete disgrace, and I want you to know that you have the full support of this office behind you." Zora nodded gratefully. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that more than I can say." Martinez leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Now, let's talk about how we're going to nail this bastard Larsson to the wall." Over the next hour, Zora recounted the details of her arrest in painstaking detail. Martinez and Chen listened intently, their expressions darkening as she described Larsson's blatant racism and abuse of power. "This is bigger than just one bad cop," Martinez said when she'd finished. "We need to look at the whole department. Larsson's behavior suggests a culture of racism and misconduct that's been allowed to fester." Chen nodded in agreement. "And we need to make sure this gets media attention. Shine a light on the problem so it can't be swept under the rug." Zora felt a surge of determination. "I want to be front and center on this, sir. I know it won't be easy, but I think it's important for people to see a black female FBI agent standing up against police brutality and systemic racism." Martinez studied her for a moment before nodding. "Are you sure? The media attention will be intense. Your whole life will be under a microscope." "I'm sure," Zora said firmly. This is why I became an agent. If I can use my position to help bring about real change, it will all be worth it." As they began outlining their strategy, Zora's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and felt a mix of emotions wash over her. "It's my parents," she said quietly. Martinez nodded understanding. "Take it. We can continue this later." Zora stepped out of the office, taking a deep breath before answering. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad." Her mother's voice came through, tight with worry. "Zora, baby, are you all right? We just saw the news." "I'm okay, Mom," Zora reassured her, fighting back tears at the sound of her mother's concern. It was bad, but I'm safe now. The Bureau is backing me up." Her father's deep voice rumbled in the background. "Let me talk to her, Sandra." There was a rustling sound, and then Colonel James Thompson's commanding tone filled the line. "Zora, what do you need from us?" Zora felt a wave of love and gratitude wash over her. Her father, ever the military man, always cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "I'm okay, Dad. Really. The Bureau is pursuing action against the officer involved. I think I'm going to be the face of this case. Try to use it to push for real change." There was a moment of silence, and Zora could picture her father's thoughtful expression. "You're sure about this? It won't be easy." "I'm sure, Dad," Zora said, her voice steady. "You and Mom taught me to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it is. This is my chance to make a real difference." She heard her father's deep sigh, a mix of pride and worry. "All right, baby girl. You know we've got your back, no matter what. Your mother and I will be on the next flight out." Zora felt a lump form in her throat. "Thanks, Dad. I love you both." As she ended the call, Zora took a moment to collect herself before rejoining Martinez and Chen. She drew strength from the knowledge that she had the support of her family, her colleagues, and her principals to guide her through the challenging days ahead. Over the next few weeks, Zora found herself at the center of a media firestorm. News of her unlawful arrest spread rapidly, igniting heated debates about police brutality, racial profiling, and the need for sweeping reforms in law enforcement. Zora worked tirelessly with the FBI's legal team and public relations department to craft a strategy for addressing the incident. She gave carefully worded interviews, sharing her experience while emphasizing the broader systemic issues at play. Her poise, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to justice in the face of adversity quickly made her a powerful voice in the ongoing national conversation about police reform. As Zora had anticipated, the increased public scrutiny was intense and often uncomfortable. Conservative pundits attempted to discredit her, digging into her background and questioning her qualifications. Online trolls hurled vile racist and sexist abuse, forcing her to limit her social media presence. But for every attack, there seemed to be a dozen supporters rallying behind her, inspired by her courage and determination. Meanwhile, the investigation into Officer Derek Larsson and the Albuquerque Police Department was proceeding at a rapid pace. The FBI's Civil Rights Division had taken over the case, with Zora's partner Marcus Chen leading the investigative team. As they dug deeper, a disturbing pattern of misconduct and racial bias within the department began to emerge. It turned out that Larsson had a long history of civilian complaints, many involving allegations of racial profiling and excessive force. However, these complaints had been consistently dismissed or buried by the department's Internal Affairs Division. The investigation also revealed that several other officers had witnessed Larsson's problematic behavior, but had remained silent out of a misguided sense of loyalty or fear of retaliation. One of the key breakthroughs in the case came when Officer Miguel Sanchez, Larsson's young partner who had been present during Zora's arrest, came forward to cooperate with the investigation. Racked with guilt over his failure to intervene, Sanchez provided crucial testimony about Larsson's history of racist comments and abusive tactics. As the evidence mounted, public pressure on the Albuquerque Police Department intensified. Community activists organized protests and rallies, demanding accountability and systemic changes. City council meetings became heated affairs, with citizens calling for the police chief's resignation and a complete overhaul of departmental policies. Through it all, Zora remained a calm and steady presence, using her platform to advocate for meaningful reforms. She worked closely with local community leaders and civil rights organizations, helping to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. The strain of being in the public eye began to take its toll on Zora. There were nights when she lay awake, replaying the humiliation of her arrest or worrying about the potential backlash against her family. But she drew strength from the support of her parents, who had temporarily relocated to Albuquerque to be near her, and from her colleagues at the FBI who rallied around her. Zora's resolve was tested when she received an anonymous threat in the mail, warning her to back off or else. The FBI took the threat seriously, assigning a protective detail to Zora and her family. Despite the fear that gnawed at her, Zora refused to be intimidated. If anything, the threat only strengthened her determination to see the case through. As weeks turned into months, the investigation continued to expand. What had started as an inquiry into one officer's misconduct had grown into a comprehensive review of the entire Albuquerque Police Department. The FBI team uncovered evidence of systemic issues, ranging from racial bias in traffic stops and searches to a lack of accountability for officer misconduct. The turning point came nearly 6 months after Zora's arrest, when a grand jury was convened to consider charges against Officer Larsson and several high-ranking members of the police department. Zora was called to testify, recounting her experience in painstaking detail before the jury. As she sat on the witness stand, Zora locked eyes with Larsson, who was seated at the defense table. The once arrogant officer now looked pale and defeated, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. Zora felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at what he had done, pity for the fear and ignorance that drove his actions, and a grim satisfaction that justice was finally being served. The grand jury proceedings lasted for weeks, with a parade of witnesses testifying about their experiences with Larsson and the broader issues within the police department. When the indictments were finally handed down, the impact was seismic. Officer Derek Larsson was charged with multiple counts of civil rights violations, false arrest, and assault. The police chief and several other high-ranking officers were indicted on charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice for their role in covering up Larsson's misconduct and perpetuating a culture of racism within the department. The announcement of the indictment sent shockwaves through Albuquerque and beyond. National news crews descended on the city, and Zora once again found herself at the center of a media frenzy. But this time, the tone was different. There was a sense of cautious optimism, a feeling that real change might finally be possible. In the wake of the indictments, the mayor of Albuquerque announced a series of sweeping reforms for the police department. These included mandatory implicit bias training for all officers, the creation of an independent civilian oversight board with real enforcement powers, and a complete overhaul of the department's use of force policies. Zora was invited to serve on a task force to help implement these reforms, working alongside community leaders, legal experts, and reform-minded officers. It was challenging work, often met with resistance from those resistant to change, but Zora found it deeply fulfilling. As the criminal cases against Larsson and the other indicted officers worked their way through the court system, Zora continued to use her platform to advocate for broader changes in policing. She testified before state legislators, pushing for laws to enhance accountability for officer misconduct and strengthen civil rights protections. The trial of Officer Derek Larsson became a national spectacle, with media outlets providing daily coverage of the proceedings. Zora's testimony was a pivotal moment in the trial, her calm and composed demeanor on the stand contrasting sharply with Larsson's increasingly erratic behavior. During cross-examination, Larsson's defense attorney attempted to paint Zora as an angry, anti-police activist who had provoked the confrontation. However, Zora's unwavering testimony and the overwhelming evidence against Larsson quickly dismantled this narrative. As the trial progressed, more details of Larsson's history of misconduct came to light. Former colleagues testified about his racist comments and aggressive tactics, while civilian victims shared their own harrowing experiences at his hands. The picture that emerged was of a deeply troubled officer who had been enabled by a system that prioritized protecting its own over serving the community. The turning point in the trial came when Officer Miguel Sanchez took the stand. In an emotional testimony, Sanchez detailed years of witnessing Larsson's abusive behavior and his own feelings of guilt and complicity for not speaking up sooner. His raw honesty and obvious remorse struck a chord with the jury and the public alike. After weeks of testimony and arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. The entire city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the verdict. Zora spent those tense days surrounded by her family and close colleagues, trying to prepare herself for any outcome. When the jury returned after just 2 days of deliberation, the courtroom was packed. Zora sat in the front row, her parents on either side of her as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. On the charge of civil rights violations, we find the defendant, Derek Larsson, guilty. A collective gasp went through the courtroom, followed by a wave of murmurs. Zora felt a rush of emotions: relief, vindication, and a bittersweet sense of justice served. On the charge of false arrest, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty. As the litany of guilty verdicts continued, Zora watched Larsson's face. The former officer seemed to shrink in on himself, the weight of his actions and their consequences finally sinking in. In the days that followed the verdict, Zora found herself thrust back into the spotlight. News programs clamored for interviews, and her phone rang constantly with calls from activists and politicians seeking her input on police reform initiatives. While the conviction of Derek Larsson was a significant victory, Zora knew it was just one step in a much longer journey. The systemic issues that had allowed someone like Larsson to abuse his power for so long were still deeply entrenched in many police departments across the country. Zora threw herself into her work with renewed vigor. She continued to serve on the Albuquerque Police Reform Task Force, pushing for meaningful changes in training, oversight, and community engagement. She also began working with national civil rights organizations to develop strategies for replicating successful reform efforts in other cities. As the months passed, Zora saw encouraging signs of progress. The Albuquerque Police Department, under new leadership, and with the reforms firmly in place, saw a significant drop in complaints of racial profiling and excessive force. Community trust in the police was slowly being rebuilt, though Zora knew it would take years to fully heal the deep-seated wounds of the past. 1 year after Larsson's conviction, Zora was invited to speak at a national conference on police reform in Washington, D.C. As she stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces, police chiefs, community activists, politicians, and fellow law enforcement officers, she felt a profound sense of purpose. A year ago, I stood on the streets of Albuquerque and experienced firsthand the injustice and humiliation that too many in our communities have faced for far too long, Zora began, her voice strong and clear. Today, we gather not to dwell on past wrongs, but to commit ourselves to building a better future. A future where the phrase "to protect and serve" truly applies to all members of our community, regardless of the color of their skin. As she continued her speech, Zora reflected on the long, difficult journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain and anger she had felt on that terrible day had been transformed into a powerful force for change. She had refused to be silenced or intimidated, and in doing so, had helped spark a movement that was reshaping not just the Albuquerque Police Department, but policing practices across the country. "This is not the end of our journey," Zora concluded, her voice ringing out over the crowd. "It is merely the beginning. The real work starts now, as we put these new policies and procedures into practice. It will take all of us, law enforcement and community members alike, working together, holding each other accountable, and never losing sight of our shared humanity. But I stand here today filled with hope, because I have seen the power of what we can accomplish when we refuse to accept injustice and instead come together to demand change." As the applause washed over her, Zora felt a sense of peace settle in her heart. The trauma of her arrest would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become the catalyst for her most important work yet, the work of building a more just and equitable society for all. In the years that followed, Zora continued to be a leading voice in the ongoing national conversation about police reform and racial justice. Her experience had given her a unique perspective that resonated with both law enforcement officials and community activists alike. Zora's work took her across the country, consulting with police departments, looking to implement similar reforms, and speaking at conferences and universities about the importance of accountability and community-oriented policing. She wrote articles and op-eds, appeared on news programs, and even co-authored a book about her experience and the broader issues of systemic racism in law enforcement. 5 years after her arrest, Zora found herself back in Albuquerque for a conference on community policing. As she walked the streets where her ordeal had begun, she was struck by how much had changed and how much work still remained to be done. The Albuquerque Police Department had undergone a dramatic transformation. Under new leadership and with the reforms firmly in place, complaints of racial profiling and excessive force had dropped significantly. Community trust in the police was slowly being rebuilt, though Zora knew it would take years to fully heal the deep-seated wounds of the past. As she passed the spot where she had been wrongfully arrested, Zora paused for a moment of reflection. She thought about Officer Larsson, wondering if his time in prison had led to any genuine change in his beliefs and attitudes. She thought about all the other black men and women who had suffered similar indignities without the benefit of her resources and platform. Most of all, she thought about the long arc of progress, how change often came in fits and starts, with setbacks and disappointments along the way. But looking around at the diverse group of officers and community members working together to build a better future, Zora felt a renewed sense of hope and purpose. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, her old partner who had since been promoted to lead the FBI's Civil Rights Division. He was checking in to see how the conference was going and to share some news about a new initiative they were launching to promote diversity in federal law enforcement recruiting. As she typed out a reply, Zora smiled to herself. The work was far from over, but she was more committed than ever to the cause of justice and equality. Her ordeal had shown her the worst of humanity, but it had also revealed the incredible capacity for change when people came together to demand it. Zora tucked her phone away and continued her walk, her steps purposeful and her head held high. She was no longer just an FBI agent or a symbol of injustice overcome. She was a catalyst for change, a voice for the voiceless, and a living testament to the power of resilience and hope in the face of adversity. As the New Mexico sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Zora felt a profound sense of gratitude. Grateful for the strength she had found within herself, for the unwavering support of her family and colleagues, and for the opportunity to turn a moment of personal tragedy into a movement for lasting change. The journey had been difficult, and there were undoubtedly more challenges ahead. But Zora Thompson was ready to face them, armed with the knowledge that every step forward, no matter how small, was a step toward a more just and equitable world for all. As she reached the end of her walk, Zora's phone rang. It was her mother, calling to check in and share some family news. As they chatted, Zora felt a wave of love and appreciation wash over her. Her parents had been her rock throughout this entire ordeal, their unwavering support giving her the strength to keep fighting even on the darkest days. After ending the call, Zora made her way back to her hotel. She had an early morning panel discussion on community policing strategies, and she wanted to review her notes one last time. As she settled into her room, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she'd come since that fateful day 5 years ago. The next morning, as Zora took her place on the panel alongside other law enforcement experts and community leaders, she felt a familiar surge of determination. The audience was a mix of police officers, activists, and local residents, a testament to the progress that had been made in bringing different perspectives to the table. As the discussion unfolded, Zora shared insights from her experience and the lessons learned from Albuquerque's reform efforts. She emphasized the importance of transparency, accountability, and genuine community engagement in rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. During the Q&A session, a young black woman stood up, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Ms. Thompson, your story inspired me to pursue a career in law enforcement. But I'm scared. How do I make a difference in a system that still has so many problems?" Zora felt a rush of emotion at the young woman's words. She remembered her own fears and doubts when she first joined the FBI, and how those feelings had been magnified after her arrest. But she also remembered the moments of progress, the small victories that had kept her going. "It won't be easy," Zora responded honestly. "You'll face challenges and setbacks, but remember why you're doing this. Every time you treat someone with respect and dignity, every time you speak up against injustice, you're making a difference. And you won't be alone. There are good people in law enforcement who want change too. Find them, support each other, and never lose sight of your principles." The young woman nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Zora made a mental note to speak with her after the panel, to offer her card and any guidance she could provide. As the conference drew to a close, Zora found herself energized by the conversations and connections she'd made. The work was far from over, but she could see the ripple effects of her efforts spreading far beyond Albuquerque. On her last night in town, Zora decided to take a walk through her old neighborhood. As she strolled down familiar streets, she was struck by how much had changed and how much remained the same. New businesses had opened, and there was a palpable sense of revitalization in the air. But she also saw the lingering effects of years of disinvestment and neglect in certain areas. As she turned a corner, Zora found herself face to face with a mural that took her breath away. It depicted a diverse group of community members and police officers standing together, with the words, "Justice, Unity, Progress" emblazoned across the top. And there, in the center of the mural, was a figure that unmistakably resembled Zora herself. Emotion welled up in Zora's throat as she stood before the mural. It was a powerful reminder of the impact one person could have, and of the collective power of a community coming together to demand change. As she stood there, lost in thought, an elderly woman approached her. "You're her, aren't you?" the woman asked, gesturing to the mural. "The FBI agent who stood up to that awful officer?" Zora nodded, slightly embarrassed by the recognition. "Yes, ma'am, that's me." The woman reached out and clasped Zora's hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "What you did, it gave us hope. It showed us that change is possible." Zora felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you," she managed to say. "But it wasn't just me. It was everyone who spoke up, who demanded justice. We did this together." The woman nodded, her eyes shining. "And we'll keep doing it together. You've inspired so many of us to keep fighting." As the woman walked away, Zora turned back to the mural, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Her ordeal had been painful, but it had also been a catalyst for real, meaningful change. And that change was continuing to ripple outward, touching lives in ways she couldn't have imagined. The next morning, as Zora prepared to leave Albuquerque, she received a call from Marcus Chen, her former partner and now head of the FBI's Civil Rights Division. "Zora," Marcus said, his voice urgent, "I've got some news you need to hear. Remember that task force we set up to investigate systemic racism in police departments across the country?" "Of course," Zora replied, her interest piqued. "What's happened?" Marcus took a deep breath. "We've uncovered evidence of a nationwide network of corrupt officers. It's big, Zora, really big, and it goes all the way up to some pretty high-ranking officials in several major cities." Zora felt a chill run down her spine. "How bad are we talking?" "Bad," Marcus said grimly. "We're seeing evidence of coordinated efforts to cover up misconduct, manipulate crime statistics, and target minority communities. It's like what we saw in Albuquerque, but on a much larger scale." Zora's mind raced with the implications. "What do you need from me?" "We're putting together a special task force to handle this investigation," Marcus explained. "Given your experience and your profile in the police reform movement, we want you to lead it. This could be a chance to drive real nationwide change in law enforcement." Zora didn't hesitate. "I'm in. When do we start?" "As soon as you can get to Washington," Marcus replied. "This is top priority. We're going to be working directly with the Attorney General on this one." As Zora ended the call, she felt a familiar mix of determination and apprehension. The task ahead would be monumental, with the potential to reshape law enforcement across the entire country. But it would also be dangerous, threatening powerful individuals who wouldn't give up their authority without a fight. On the flight back to Washington, D.C., Zora began to sketch out plans for the investigation. She knew they would need a diverse team of agents, forensic accountants, and legal experts. They would also need to work closely with trusted community leaders and reform-minded officers who could provide crucial insights and support. As the plane touched down in D.C., Zora felt a sense of déjà vu. Once again, she was stepping into the center of a storm, preparing to confront deeply entrenched systems of injustice. But this time, she wasn't alone. She had the weight of her experiences, the support of her colleagues, and the backing of communities across the country who were demanding change. Over the next few months, Zora threw herself into the investigation. The task force worked tirelessly, following leads, analyzing data, and building a comprehensive picture of the corruption network they were up against. It was grueling work, often met with resistance and obstruction from those in power. There were moments of frustration and setbacks. Witnesses backed out at the last minute, evidence disappeared, and political pressure mounted to slow or stop the investigation. But there were also breakthroughs. Whistleblowers coming forward with crucial information, community activists providing valuable local insights, and reform-minded officers risking their careers to support the investigation. As the evidence mounted, Zora and her team began to see the full scope of the corruption they were uncovering. It wasn't just about individual bad actors, but about a system that had been designed to protect those in power at the expense of the communities they were meant to serve. 6 months into the investigation, Zora received an anonymous tip that would blow the case wide open. A high-ranking officer in the Chicago Police Department, racked with guilt over years of complicity, had decided to come forward with detailed records of the corruption network's activities. The information provided by this whistleblower was the key they needed to connect all the dots. It revealed a complex web of payoffs, cover-ups, and coordinated efforts to maintain the status quo across multiple police departments. With this new evidence in hand, Zora and her team worked around the clock to prepare their case. They knew they would only get one shot at this, and they had to make it count. Finally, after nearly a year of intense investigation, Zora stood beside the Attorney General as he announced a sweeping series of indictments against police officers and officials in cities across the country. It was the largest police corruption case in U.S. history, with the potential to fundamentally reshape law enforcement nationwide. As Zora watched the press conference unfold, she felt a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction at seeing justice finally being served, but also a deep sadness at the extent of the corruption they had uncovered. She thought about all the lives that had been affected by this broken system, all the communities that had suffered under its weight. In the days and weeks that followed, Zora found herself at the center of a media storm once again. But this time, she was ready for it. She used every interview and public appearance as an opportunity to push for comprehensive police reform, emphasizing the need for greater accountability, improved training, and genuine community engagement. The impact of the investigation was seismic. Police departments across the country faced intense scrutiny, with many undergoing top-to-bottom reviews of their practices and policies. State legislatures rushed to pass new laws, strengthening oversight and accountability measures. And at the federal level, there was renewed momentum for comprehensive police reform legislation. But Zora knew that legal and policy changes were only part of the solution. Real, lasting change would require a fundamental shift in the culture of policing and in society's approach to public safety. To that end, Zora began working with a coalition of community leaders, reform-minded police officers, and policy experts to develop a new model for community-centered policing. Their goal was to create a framework that prioritized de-escalation, mental health support, and genuine partnership with the communities being served. As the months turned into years, Zora saw encouraging signs of progress. Police departments that adopted the new model saw significant reductions in use of force incidents and improvements in community trust. Young people from diverse backgrounds were being recruited into law enforcement, bringing fresh perspectives and a commitment to equitable policing. 10 years after her wrongful arrest on that Albuquerque street, Zora stood before a crowd gathered on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. She had been invited to speak at a rally marking the anniversary of landmark police reform legislation that had grown out of her investigation. As she looked out at the sea of faces, people of all races, ages, and backgrounds united in their commitment to justice and equality, Zora felt a profound sense of hope. The journey had been long and difficult, marked by setbacks and struggles. But standing there, she could see tangible evidence of how far they had come. 10 years ago, I experienced firsthand the injustice that too many in our communities have faced for far too long, Zora began, her voice strong and clear. Today, we gather not to declare victory, but to recommit ourselves to the ongoing work of building a more just and equitable society. She spoke about the progress that had been made, the reforms implemented, the corrupt officers held accountable, the lives changed for the better. But she also emphasized the work that still lay ahead, the need for continued vigilance and activism. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, Zora said, quoting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But it doesn't bend on its own. It bends because of the countless individuals who refuse to accept injustice, who stand up and demand change, who do the hard work day in and day out to build the world we want to see. As she concluded her speech, Zora felt a sense of peace wash over her. The trauma of her arrest would always be a part of her story, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a life dedicated to the pursuit of justice and equality. The crowd erupted in applause as Zora stepped back from the podium. As she made her way off the stage, she was surrounded by well-wishers, young activists seeking advice, reformed police officers sharing stories of change, community leaders expressing gratitude for her work. In that moment, Zora Thompson knew that while the journey was far from over, they were on the right path. The work of building a more just and equitable society would never truly be finished. But with each step forward, each life touched, each system reformed, they were creating a better world for generations to come. As the sun set over the National Mall, casting a golden glow over the gathered crowd, Zora felt a profound sense of gratitude. Grateful for the strength she had found within herself, for the unwavering support of her family and colleagues, and for the opportunity to be part of a movement larger than herself. The future was uncertain, but Zora Thompson was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the knowledge that change was possible, that justice could prevail, and that together they could build a world where the promise of equality under the law was not just a lofty ideal, but a lived reality for all.